Before the war, Brandon, like any other town in Britain, had a strict social structure. Those who held wealth also held the power and made decisions that affected the daily lives of the working class men and women. Then war was declared. The German successes in France led to real fears that Britain would be in line for invasion. The trouble was, the career soldiers and territorials were over in France, and if they were defeated, then who would defend Brandon? Sure, there were soldiers billeted in Brandon, but they were under the command of the British Army and could be assigned to anywhere in the country. There was only one answer. The townsfolk would have to defend the town on their own. This would only work if the wealthy landowner, the magistrate, the factory owner, the shopkeeper and the farm labourer worked together in a combined effort. In 1915, the question of who would defend Brandon if the Germans came was answered. The townsfolk created their own militia. When war was declared, young, able-bodied men rushed to enlist into the army. When the threat of invasion became real, many communities across Britain formed their own local militias to defend themselves from the German army. At first, the British government were reluctant to acknowledge these groups, as they felt it may detract from men joining the regular army. In 1915, that acknowledgement came, and the government endorsed them as a single entity. They were known as the Volunteer Training Corps. These groups became the Home Guard 25 years before the real Home Guard became a thing in the Second World War. The Volunteer Training Corps offered a chance for old soldiers or other men who were too old or unfit for general service to contribute to the war effort. It also gave a first taste of military discipline for the younger ones who were just too young to enlist, but who would, no doubt, go into the army if the war went on beyond 1915. There was no financial support from the government, who perceived the finances were best suited for taking the fight to the enemy, not in defending British civilians. Nor would the Volunteer Training Corps receive uniforms or weapons. Anything the volunteers wanted would have to be raised locally. Brandon held its first meeting to gather support for their militia in March 1915. The meeting, held in the Paget Hall on the High Street, was told that the unit would not be supplied any weapons, but nonetheless there were enough guns in town that the group could get access to. Colonel Britton, from the Central Association of the Volunteer Training Corps, addressed the meeting and suggested the railway line would be a prime target for any German spy or saboteur. Any volunteer patrolling the area could easily dispatch the enemy with a shotgun from 30 to 40 yards. That night, 33 Brandon men signed on the dotted line to defend Brandon. By the end of the month, that number had swelled to 80, and initially Brandon's volunteers only carried out drills and parades around town, which was, in itself, good for installing army discipline. Then, Sir John Aird of Brandon Park Estate gifted the volunteers with new uniforms and rifles. From that point, they looked like Brandon's own private army. Albert Rout, owner of the fur factory in George Street, supported them too. He installed a small rifle range on his land at Heath House, just off Bury Road, for the lads to hone their weaponry skills on. And by all accounts, Brandon's Volunteer Training Corps were one of the best in the region, which was demonstrated when they were singled out for praise at a huge parade of Suffolk Volunteer Training Corps men that took place on Angel Hill, Bury St Edmunds. They even had their own band, featuring young, enthusiastic boys. As a demonstration of the volunteers' commitment, even their oldest member, 70-year-old William Talbot, did the 12-mile route march to Lakenheath and back. Mr. Edgington, the Brandon schoolmaster, even wore his uniform to his daughter's wedding. Brandon people were rightly proud of their volunteers. In 1915, as the name suggests, the Volunteer Training Corps was exactly that, manned by volunteers. However, Before the war was over, it would be compulsory, and there were even calls in Brandon for any deserters from it to be punished as if they were in the army. The volunteers then became an extension of the army. Brandon's volunteers even handed out military ranks to themselves. The business owners were lieutenants, while the rank of private was allocated to the general farm and factory labourers. In his annual review, Brandon's medical officer declared that the previous year, 1914, had seen 13 cases of diphtheria, 8 cases of scarlet fever and 5 cases of tuberculosis. The movement of troops in and out of town had increased the chances of disease spreading, but the last thing the war effort needed was soldiers incapacitated by a sick local. The authorities reacted by declaring that any Brandon resident showing symptoms of these diseases, along with measles and mumps, was to notify the town's council. The council would then ensure these people and their families were quarantined in their homes until either the disease or they had passed. April alone saw 4 notifications of scarlet fever. Those failing to inform the council when they had an outbreak in their home would be severely prosecuted. Samuel and Maggie Gathercole of Town Street found themselves summoned before town magistrates when they took their daughter Mary into town despite her displaying symptoms of scarlet fever. On that occasion, the magistrates issued a caution to the parents after they felt the parents' ignorance of the symptoms of scarlet fever had contributed to them not informing the authorities and quarantining the girl. Brandon welcomed its transient troops. Those billeted in and around town were greeted with open arms. Soldiers were given the use of the Paget Hall for quiet reflection or for use as a social room to chat, play games and smoke. This became a place of respite from the rigours of training for war. Books, writing paper, pens and games were all placed at their disposal. The Church Institute and other church buildings were similarly stocked, but these also served as canteens for soldiers. One Methodist church reportedly served up 60 meals in a single evening sitting. Locals provided entertainment of singing, reciting poetry and acting out comedy sketches. In many cases the troops reciprocated the entertainment, and perhaps the most appreciated were the Welsh Fusiliers, who in April delighted Brandon with their singing in St Peter's Church. Perhaps the locals had never heard a Welsh choir before, but such was the impression the soldiers made on the locals that a bond formed between them. The following month, many locals made their way to the railway station and waved the soldiers off as they departed Brandon for another base elsewhere. What is not known is the reaction from Brandon to the Essex Regiment Artillery Unit. These servicemen put on a sports day in the summer. It featured not only the obligatory tug of war and swimming contest, but also wrestling on horseback. At night, the enemy could be heard above town. Reports circulated of East Anglian towns being bombed and further heightened anxiety about invasion. The enemy were coming across in huge rigid balloons, Zeppelins. Brandon people heard these Zeppelins as they lay in their beds at night, never knowing if they would be the next victim of what would seem to them to be an alien craft. A strict blackout was implemented. No one, and I mean no one, would be allowed to show any light at night time. If you could not stop the light from escaping your doors and windows, then you should not have the light on. The fear of residents of being bombed in their bed was very real. The fear came not that they would be the intended target, for I'm sure they all felt they were adhering to the blackout, but instead from the indiscriminate nature of bombing. The Zeppelin bombs, which were very rudimental compared to even the Second World War bombs, were not accurate, and it was often felt the intended target, perhaps somebody showing light, would not be the victim. No, the victim would be the innocent household in the next street who was adhering to the blackout. With the onset of autumn, the evening services at St Peter's Church were brought forward to late afternoon because the rector could not guarantee all light would be blocked from those large windows. The town clock, which had just undergone renovation at the time, could not be illuminated either, nor could any of the town's gas street lights. Nighttime travel became very dangerous. Complaints came to the council that the metal bollards at the end of the avenue could not be seen at night, so the bollards were removed. Even Brandon School changed its hours to finish earlier. Everybody was doing their part. The police and the courts took a very dim view of anyone showing light from their properties at night time, and they ruthlessly prosecuted them. The first in Brandon were Edith Clark of the White Hart Hotel and Walter Talbot, landlord of the Duke of Wellington pub. Both had been spotted allowing light showing in September. The White Hart Hotel had a Venetian blind not closed properly, and the front door of the Duke of Wellington had not been closed at night time. Both received fines after being found guilty of breaking the blackouts at their court hearings in October. 1915 also saw the first specific reference of war work in Brandon. Before the war, the Spartan Engine Company made small engines and pumps from what is now the site of Tesco on London Road. Then, in wartime, their lathes produced 6-inch artillery shell casings, and by the end of the war over 8,000 had been made. Their male employees were protected from joining the army due to working in an occupation vital for the war effort. These men received a certificate to provide evidence to anyone who asked that they were not dodging their obligations in the war. One member of staff was a familiar face to the town. He was the Reverend Cornelius Mensink from the Baptist Church, who was sharing his time between the spiritual needs of the town and the war effort of the nation. Again, everyone was playing their part. In October 1915, Brandon held a memorial service at St. Peter's Church to remember those men killed in just over a year of war. 16 men from Brandon were remembered at that service. Prayers were also said for James Dyer, who was still officially listed as missing. The military informed his parents of this status way back in August 1914. In December 1915, James's parents, living in London Road, were formally informed by the War Office that since no one had any idea of what happened to their son over the past 16 months, then everyone back home should just presume he had been killed in action. His body was never found.
Give